Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. We've been talking about how to find sites and prepare for an excavation in Minecraft, but there's something that I haven't really told you yet. There is more than one way to dig a site. In this video, we're going to talk about different excavation techniques that you can use in Minecraft and why archaeologists use them in real life. The first thing you need to know about is setting up what's called a site grid. This technically isn't an excavation style by itself, but a lot of excavation relies on a site grid, so I'm just going to put it in here. Basically, a site grid is a way of measuring and locating things within a site without needing to rely on geographical coordinates and GPS systems. We start with a datum or 0 point, which is a point on the site that we arbitrarily label as 0, 0. We then make every other measurement on site in relation to the datum point. So this is a desert pyramid that we want to document and excavate. The first thing we're going to do is set up a datum point. Usually we try to put the datum in one corner of the site or trench that we're going to excavate, just so that we're always working in positive numbers. Now we don't have much space over here, so putting a datum point over this way is going to be a little tricky. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put the datum point on the side over here. We're gonna go from the last point that's visible, which is basically right here, and we're just gonna count out like 10 blocks. I'm gonna go in a diagonal. I'm just gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And that's a pretty good place for our datum point. It's a little bit hidden, but that's okay. And we've got our banner of 0, 0, so we're gonna label this as 0, 0. Once we have the datum, then we can run tape measures going north, south, and east, west, and that will give us measurements for everything else in the site. So with this desert temple, I've put my datum in the southwest corner of the site, and one of my tape measures would run from the datum directly east, while another one would run from the datum directly north. Some smaller sites will just leave the tape measure laid out like this while they excavate, but most of the time we'll mark certain intervals like every 10 meters and then take the tape away so that it doesn't get damaged. So 10 meters east of the datum, we might put a small post or a flag or something that labels that point as 10, 0. We do this on the north running line too, so you can always tell where something is on a site. Now, here's an advanced tip if you happen to want one, and also if you don't happen to want one, because I'm going to say it anyway. Many datum points aren't actually labeled 0, 0. I know, I just said that that's what it was, but many sites will use 100, 100 for a datum point, or even maybe 1000, 1000. Why do we do that? Because negative numbers are hard. Let's use a trail ruin this time for a demonstration. When we see a trail ruin on the ground, we have only a few blocks that we can see. We know that the trail ruin is a whole lot bigger than this, and that it usually has a road that leads off in at least one direction and has multiple buildings around it. The problem is that we don't know which direction the road is going to go when we set up our datum point. We do know that the building we can already see is going to get a bit chunky near the bottom because it tends to expand to like a 3 building wide structure. So we're not going to set our datum right next to this visible bit of the building, we'll set it over here, about 25 blocks away from the southwest corner of this structure. If we labeled this as 0, 0, if the trail ruins road heads off to the west, we're gonna have to use negative numbers as soon as it crosses that datum point. The same is true if the road goes south. But if we make our datum point 100, 100, then if the road goes west or south, our coordinates are still in positive numbers. So instead of ending up with some features that are at -15, -24, and some that are at 1524, we have some coordinates at 8576 and some coordinates at 115, 124. So far I've only talked about the horizontal plane, so our X and Z coordinates in Minecraft. But a datum also marks out our Y coordinate. That also often uses something like 100 instead of 0, because if it used 0, you would have to get into negative numbers as soon as you go below that level. Most of this trail ruin is going to be under our datum point, and I don't know about you, but I really don't want to work in negative numbers while digging most of this site. In Minecraft, we have coordinates that are available at any time from the debug screen, so we don't necessarily need a datum point. In real life, publicly available reliable GPS systems are actually relatively new. They only really became available to the public in the early 2000s, and as any of us who have used a GPS or sat-nav are aware, they are not always terribly accurate. Also, for anyone who's ever been in a location that doesn't get cell phone signal, which is pretty much all of us, right? You'll know that GPS technology isn't always available even if you have the proper equipment. Lots and lots of archaeological sites are not in places that have good cell phone signal, so it can be really difficult to get GPS measurements at an archaeological site. The site grid lets you take accurate locational data for anything on the site, even when your GPS isn't working. We do take GPS measurements as well, but generally speaking, we tend to use our site grid as, at the very least, a backup option, but it's really kind of the main way that we measure things on site. Okay, so once you have a site grid, you can start excavating. There are a few different ways to excavate and a few different degrees of excavation, so let's get into it. The first thing you can do that counts as actual digging at a site is something called coring, sample coring, or auger coring. Corers or augers are tools with either a corkscrew or sharp blades on the bottom, a handle on the top, and often a hollow shaft running from the bottom to the handle, or like a hollow scoop that's at the bottom. They work by jamming the cutting bits into the earth and then twisting the handle so that it cuts into the dirt. You twist as far as you can and then pull it out and take a look at what's inside. These types of cores are very similar to ice cores, which you might have heard about in ecology and geology. They give a very small sample of the full set of soil layers in an area, which can give us a really good sense of whether there's archaeology in that spot or what that archaeology might look like. Coring is really useful for getting a sense of a large area or for confirming whether the archaeology you thought was in a spot actually is in that spot. The downside to coring, though, is that it only covers a very small amount of the site, and the blade on the end can also break artifacts or damage structures. I know I said twist until you can't twist anymore, but sometimes you twist until you hear a loud crunching noise, and it turns out that you've cored right into some pottery sherds. In Minecraft, you might decide coring could help with understanding a site. Going back to our trail ruin, we still don't know which direction the road runs, but if we move about 10 to 15 blocks away from the center in each direction and core down, we'll hit either a building or a road in at least one of those spots. That lets you know which direction the trail ruin is oriented, so you don't have to worry about whether you'll need to move your beacon or chests and things halfway through the dig. I will also just note, the cores that we get in archaeology are usually about 2 to 10 centimeters in diameter. They're not huge, but Minecraft obviously doesn't work at that scale, and we also don't have a corer in this game, so we're digging it ourselves. Rather than dig a 1-block hole straight down like I'm doing, you may want to do the usual 2-block coring method depending on where the trail ruin generates. The next level of digging that you can do is called shovel test pits, or STPs. Shovel test pits are usually 1 by 1 meter or sometimes 2 by 2 meter trenches that we dig to get a sense of what archaeology is in an area. They can often show the extent of a site or uncover features at a site that are made of materials that don't show up well in geophysical survey. If we've got an area where we're not sure what archaeology is there, we'll do a number of shovel test pits around the area to sample what is there. Shovel test pits are really popular in North American archaeology, particularly in commercial archaeology or culture resource management, or CRM, which is the archaeology that has to happen on a site before any construction can begin. Shovel test pits and auger coring are all about sampling, which means that they rely on that site grid that we laid out. We're working on a slightly larger scale in Minecraft than we would in reality, but by laying out squares in our site grid, we can decide which squares to core and which ones to dig shovel test pits in. Shovel test pits aren't hugely useful for the vanilla pre-generated archaeological structures in Minecraft, but they could be useful if you're digging a site that you or maybe some friends have built and buried in your own world. How do we decide which squares to core or dig? Using sampling strategies. So, sampling strategies are basically the logic behind why we choose to dig or core where we do. There are two main decisions you need to make when sampling: a simple versus a stratified sample, and a random versus a systematic sample. To decide between a simple or stratified sample, let's look at our site grid again. Say we can dig 20 shovel test pits in this area that each measure 1 meter by 1 meter. A simple sample means that we treat all areas of the grid the same, so even though some parts of the grid are on a riverbed, some parts are on a beach, and some are in some old growth taiga, we're not going to take that into consideration when deciding where to dig our shovel test pits. That's a bit of an extreme example, but you can imagine that people do different things in a forest, on a riverbank, and in a meadow, and that what we can expect to find in each of these biomes is going to differ. Simple surveys don't take that into account, so our 20 shovel test pits will be evenly spread across the entire site. The stratified samples do take things like biome into account. So in the case of this trail ruin, about 15% of our grid is in the riverbed, 20% is in the beach, and 65% is in the taiga biome. If we're digging 20 squares, then a stratified sample says that 15% of those squares should be in the riverbed, 20% should be along the beach, and 65% are in the taiga. Once we've allocated each biome the same relative proportion of shovel test pits as it covers in our site grid, then we're going to determine where those squares go, either randomly or systematically. If we use a random sample, then we're going to give each of these grid squares a number and then use a random number generator to tell us which squares we're digging. Like a simple sample, a random sample reduces any bias that we might be bringing to the samples, so it can be really good if you're working in an area where you're worried about modern biases and conceptions of what people did in the past seeping into how you're doing your archaeology. On the other hand, a systematic sample means that we use a specific method for choosing which squares we dig, and that's going to differ from site to site. So it might be every fourth square, or maybe within a 2x2 set of squares we dig the southeasternmost one, or something like that. Systematic samples can also be very useful. If you have a large site with a variety of buildings, a systematic sample ensures that you've covered each area of the site to the same extent, so you're not missing out on a large cluster of artifacts or buildings, for example. So between these two choices, simple versus stratified and random versus systematic, you end up with 4 main sampling strategies: a simple random sample, a simple systematic sample, a stratified random sample, and a stratified systematic sample. A simple random sample means that we use a random number generator to tell us where to dig, and we treat all areas of the site equally. A simple systematic sample means that we're still going to be treating all areas of the site equally, but we're going to create a pattern or a system for determining which squares to dig that isn't just a random number generator. A stratified random sample means that we first divide the number of shovel test pits or cores that we're going to do between the different environments or biomes in our grid, and then we use a random number generator to tell us which squares in each biome we're going to dig. And finally, a stratified systematic sample means that we will first divide the number of shovel test pits or cores we're going to do between the different environments or biomes in our grid, and then we will use a predetermined system that we have created to decide where to dig, like digging every third square in that biome. Okay, so let's get to the next level of excavation, which is really about the same amount of excavation as shovel test pits. It's just a different style of doing something like shovel test pits. These are called evaluation trenches. Evaluation trenches are a 20 to 50 meter long and 1 to 2 meter wide strip of land that we excavate to get a sense of what's at a site. Ideally, these trenches start at some known archaeology at the site and then expand from there. These can be better than shovel test pits because they cover a continuous area rather than serving as small snapshots across a site. But, as you may have guessed, they can also miss out on archaeology that doesn't fall into that 20 to 50 meter line. On the other hand, this is how long these trenches often are, so they do cover quite a bit of ground. Evaluation trenches are good for figuring out what's at a site, if anything. It's a really popular technique in commercial archaeology in the United Kingdom, and again, commercial archaeology is archaeology that must happen before any construction can begin. Evaluation trenches are also handy if you think that there's archaeology at a site, but you haven't been able to make the case for a larger excavation. Evaluation trenches, like shovel test pits, aren't automatically useful in Minecraft. We don't need them with the pre-generated structures because we already know what's there, and coring is a much easier way of figuring out which direction the trail ruins run, which is the main thing that we don't know about these sites when we first find them. But, similar to shovel test pits, if you're on a server where someone has built and buried a site, then an evaluation trench might be a good way to go. So now we're getting into the big-time archaeological excavation techniques, the ones that we use when we're digging as much of a site as we feel is reasonable. There are 2 big excavation methods, the box grid excavation and the open area excavation. Let's talk about the box grid first, since it uses our grid system again. The box grid, which is also called the Wheeler box grid, was first coined by Sir Mortimer Wheeler, which is why it's also called the Wheeler box grid. Sir Mortimer Wheeler was a British archaeologist working primarily in India, and he found that for the soil type and sites that he tended to dig, a box grid worked best. These days, the box grid is still used in a lot of South Asian archaeology as well as American archaeology. The box grid method takes our site grid again and divides things into squares based on that grid. These squares are usually between 2 by 2 meters to 4 by 4 meters, but they can also be larger. So in our grid, let's use 4 by 4 meter squares. We will excavate each of those squares, or at least most of them, but in between each square, we're going to leave a wall of unexcavated dirt. These walls are called balks, and they can be anywhere from about 50 centimeters to about 2 meters thick, although the usual size is roughly a meter. The box grid gives a really clear view of the stratigraphy, or the layers of soil and archaeology that are across the entire site because of these balks. The downside to the box grid is that for safety reasons, an excavated square in the box grid shouldn't be any deeper than it is wide. So for this trench, ideally, these squares shouldn't be more than 4 meters deep. You can combine squares if they need to go deeper, but the balks might run into structural problems if you do. Granted, digs in reality don't often go 4 meters deep or deeper. I mean, a number of them do, but a lot of them also don't, so you wouldn't necessarily need to worry about that in real life. In Minecraft, we all know that the trail ruins are way deeper than 4 meters down, so the box grid is technically a less helpful method in Minecraft, but we also don't have to worry about the physics of a 20-meter tall wall of unfortified dirt in Minecraft, so you can still use a box grid to fully excavate a trail ruin because it is safe to do in Minecraft. The other main excavation method is open area excavation. Open area excavation uncovers a large area of the site, often in the 10 meter by 40 meter range or larger, and then looks at what identifiable archaeological features we can find within that trench. Generally, we only excavate the archaeologically relevant stuff, so we end up with trenches that have a number of holes in various different places. This is the kind of excavation that I've done in my previous videos on trail ruins, and it's the same technique that we used during the Great Big Minecraft dig. It's a really popular technique in the UK because we have a lot of archaeology from a bunch of different time periods right near the surface of our soil. So it gives us a really good sense of what is where and how the different elements relate to each other. One downside is that open area excavation can require a lot more measuring of where things are because we don't tend to number the squares in our site grid, but things like levels and total stations have made a lot of that measuring rather straightforward. Personally, if you're excavating a trail ruin, I would recommend using open area, but it might be fun to switch it up sometime and try the box grid. Just make sure that you can get out of your boxes. Bring ladders or rockets or something. These definitely aren't the only excavation styles in archaeology, but they are the main ones that you'll see archaeologists using, or the main ones that you'll see variations of across the world. If you want to see the open area technique in action in real time, check out my video of the Great Big Minecraft dig. That's all from me for today. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!